Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my utmost pleasure to be here with you today. And first of all, I would like to thank the organization, the ORF, for the kind invitation, as well as the esteemed audience for your attention. So I belong to CEiiA, an engineering and product development center which is based in Portugal. And the first question is, why is Portugal represented in an emerging space actors panel? So we have been part of the European Space Agency for almost 2 decades now, so one would think that we are quite advanced in terms of our programs, and we have participated in most of the significant programs at ESA level, at the European Space Agency level. But at the national level, I could say and I can state that we are much less advanced than all these countries that came in before us. So we don't have a space agency, we don't have a proper defined policy. So it's the first time for many years that we are now starting to define that as a country. So our goal really is to come into the new space thinking about it as a network for opportunities. And with this mindset, there have been some policies coming in recent years. So the first one and more important is modern space strategy for the country, thinking about 2030. So it's being called Portugal Space 2030. Together with this space strategy, which is the first time the country is thinking about space in a very organized fashion and thinking about its own interests at the country level, we are linking this strategy to a global pilot action in the Atlantic Ocean. So Portugal is that small rectangle over there, which sits in the Atlantic Ocean. And right now, it has one of the biggest economic exclusive trade zones in the world. And if its continental shelf extension, which was requested to the UN, gets approved, the country will have 97% of its territory as the Atlantic Ocean. So the Atlantic is something which has been, since ever, very important for us and the seas as a whole. So let me share with you a little bit about this space strategy and what does it encompass, as well as this pilot action, and finally I will finish by wrapping up what we have been doing at my institution in the recent years. So some context. As I said, Portugal got enrolled in the European Space Agency back in the year 2000, so almost 2 decades. We have right now over 100 national entities which represent the ecosystem of space entities in Portugal. Globally, the country has invested about 230 million euros in space programs, which came back to the industry worth a revenue, a turnover of around 890 million euros. So it was clear for the country, with the experience of these 2 decades, that space is a segment of high spillover, technological spillover and economical spillover. So coming to the new space, it was clear for the country that we needed to have our own strategy, that we needed to have perhaps our own access to space, or at least jointly build up capacity with other countries, and that we needed to have our strategy to not only be tier 2s or tier 3s at the European level, but also to have some representation at the products level, so the satellites level, let's say. So Portugal Space 2030 this strategy has been under consultation for some months now, public consultation, and just this week it got approved at a National Council of Ministers back in Portugal, and it has 3 main pillars. One is focused on the markets. So it is clear for this strategy that one should immediately exploit the thousands of data which are already being generated by European satellites. And this means down-to-earth applications very much focused on the needs at the country level, either surveillance or monitoring, or just really understanding the ecosystems with a great focus on the ocean. The second one, which is more on the medium to long term, is the supply. And this means building the capacity to become a player at an international level. So far Portugal has been building, or the Portuguese industry has been building subsystems, or even not that, or just supplying engineering. So the idea is that through the development and demonstration of our own satellites, and here we are talking about small satellites, and by opening new areas of intervention, such as the small launchers, for example, one could in the future profit of this experience by getting integrator in the big players game, one can say it this way. And the third vector, which is critical for the country, is the skills. So it is clear for us that there has to be a continuous investment on building up capacity, and this means an investment in science, innovation, and definitely education at all levels. So to build up this strategy, there has been a framework which is being created. So first of all, there is no such thing as a space activities bill or a space law in Portugal. So this is something that has to be built and which is currently being discussed with many countries around Europe, but also around the world. For example, the UK has been quite supportive on helping us doing this, the Luxembourg as well. So there have been discussions with many countries. The financial framework, it's quite important. So it is clear that if Portugal is moving forward with such a strategy, this will not be a 100% public investment. So when we are starting right now talking about having a Portuguese space agency, it is clear that it cannot be a typical space agency. It will have to be a private-public joint venture. So the institutional framework, so there is currently an alignment between all stakeholders, so the policymakers, the industry, the universities, and this is quite important to having a long-term strategy which is not dependent on which government is ruling at the short term. And then obviously the international environment. So it's clear for Portugal, which is actually a nation which has always been thinking at a worldwide level since the discovery's time, that this cannot be done alone. We are a small country in Europe. We have only 10 million inhabitants, so we are very small compared to the scale of the world, so we have to do this in an international fashion together with many emerging actors. And then we have something unique, which we are trying to understand if we can exploit something out of it, which is the Azores. So the Azores are a beautiful archipelago of islands which sit in the mid-Atlantic and which are quite a fantastic location to perhaps have a spaceport targeting new space applications. So it has about 1,500 kilometers of open ocean in all directions. It is part of European territory, so it's in the Schengen area. It is near the equator, so it is easy to get to space, and there are a bunch of infrastructures which have been sitting there for a long time. So the Portuguese government and the Portuguese agencies have been recently investing on understanding if it would be feasible or not to build such a spaceport in this location. And there have been a couple of studies which have already been published. The most recent one was just this week, actually yesterday, it was published back in Portugal. It was made by the University of Texas. And it was really a feasibility assessment on if this would be interesting from a technological point of view, but also from an economic point of view. There are a couple of studies being undertaken by the European Space Agency, and there are certainly some studies being undertaken by Portuguese entities, private and obviously public. So in the medium term, besides this space strategy, it is also our goal to really understand and study the technical feasibility of having such a spaceport. Would or not this be interesting for the new space industries? And this is something which is being discussed with many players, from private entities back in Europe like Airbus or OHB and many others, but also with big countries around the world like India and China. So they see this possibility as something which might be interesting for them as well. So it's something we definitely will pursue in the near future. So now, let's go to this global action that I was mentioning. So in parallel to really drafting this space strategy agenda for Portugal, there has been an action being put together over the last 2 years, which has had at least a dozen of workshops set all around the world, and which is called the Atlantic International Research Center. And the idea, it started with Portugal and mainly in the Azores as a unique environment for really exploring and exploiting the resources of the Atlantic from space to actually the deep sea. But it has easily been extended to many countries around the globe. And the idea was really to foster science through the establishment of an integrated governance program for the Atlantic in a sustainable manner, really trying to explore the Atlantic resources. So what has been done so far in this context? So an agenda for scientific cooperation, technology, and innovation has been set, and this is public. It's something that you can check online. and it has been set to strengthen the cooperation and the interconnections between North and South Atlantic to actually tackle some of biggest global societal challenges, such as understanding, for example, climate changes, or studying the ecosystem of the ocean, or atmospheric science. And doing this in a multidisciplinary manner, making use of space technology for Earth observation, but also making use of in situ observation with ocean technology, and really processing all these data to have meaningful results. So as I said, there have been more than a dozen of workshops on this, and 2 high-level dialogues between industry, policymakers, and science. The second dialogue, the first one was held in the Azores. The second dialogue was held in Florianopolis in Brazil last November. And actually in this event, there has been signed the agreement to actually bring to light this center. So 10 countries, 8 countries signed the agreement. 2 countries, South Africa and UK, have been signing it as observation countries. And the founding committee has been established, and there are already some actions across the both sides of the ocean, from Nigeria to South Africa to Brazil to Uruguay, Spain, Portugal. There are many countries involved in this initiative to really start acting in a networked fashion and start integrating different space programs, but not only. So coming to the end, just explaining you a little bit what is CEiiA and what do we do. So as I said, there is no such thing as a space agency in Portugal. There is a space office which is coordinated by our national funding agency. So within the scope of the national funding agency, the space office is something minor which has a few resources. So our Center of Engineering and Product Development acts like a strong arm towards action. So we are not university related, we are not an industry, we are a non-profit institution which actually tries to bridge the gap between these 2 realities in all the technology markets that Portugal has been investing in recent years. So from the automotive to aeronautics to ocean programs and more recently space, we have been trying to actually build the network of value and the network of players at the national level to really build up the needed value chain. So we are about 300 people right now. We are based in the north of Portugal, in Porto, and in our center we can basically go from the idea to the testing, the prototyping. So we are quite a big institution for Portuguese level, and we are certainly the biggest employer of aerospace engineers back in Portugal. So it makes all sense for us to participate in this new endeavor. Just to give you one examples of products and technologies that we have been evolving. As I said, we started in the automotive industry. We worked around electric vehicles for urban mobility context. We built up the value chain. We are currently, together with many Portuguese entities, running to try and industrialize that vehicle over there, which is B. We have worked with many major aircraft OEMs from Brazil, with Embraer to Leonardo helicopters in the UK. And finally, we moved to oceans and space, and this is my final slide. I just want to spend a couple of minutes here explaining how are we moving forward with this new space context. So Portugal has had one satellite, which is called POSSAT-1, which was launched to space almost 3 decades ago. And it was, well, people say it was developed in Portugal, but it was actually integrated in Portugal. So it was acquired and there was some technology transfer, but it stopped there basically. There was no true involvement of the Portuguese industry. So just last year, the Portuguese industry, together with the research centers and the universities, got itself organized and built up a private-public venture to actually develop the first Portuguese microsatellite, which is called Infant, which is the satellite you see over there in that corner. So it's a satellite which is very much targeted towards ocean observation and communications. It's a small satellite, 40 centimeters by 20 by 20 in a low Earth orbit, and we hope to launch it back in the year 2020. And hopefully for us, we have been trying to build up the efforts to make it the first out of a constellation of 12 to 16 satellites. And we have been trying to pitch in many players from India to back in Europe to join us in this effort and to have back-to-back investment on this area. So we still have a long way to go, and I really just wanted to give you a full picture of where we are at in terms of technology as well as in terms of policy. Thank you very much for your attention.